Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I'm excited to talk to the author of the November 2024 Aviatrix Book Club discussion book, Shoot Like a Girl, One Woman's Dramatic Fight in Afghanistan and on the Home Front. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the literary aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Mary Jennings Hegar, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
Oh my goodness, are you kidding? I'm so excited to talk to you. I loved your book. Can you give us, for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it yet, can you give us an overview and maybe do a reading?
Sure. It's my autobiography just from, growing up in Connecticut under a very abusive biological father to then escaping when I was 7 and moving to Texas with my mom and my sister and growing up there, the discrimination I faced in my journey to try to become a pilot, which really I just wanted to be Han Solo is really what it boiled down to. And flying in combat was the closest I was going to get to that. So, and then, I take the reader through pilot training. I think there's a lot of people who want to know what that's like. And, I think I was really careful not to just focus on discrimination throughout the book, but it obviously informs the narrative. I tried to focus on things that I feel like we need to talk about more as a society. And I think I hit most of the right notes because when I go do book signings or speeches or whatever, usually the feedback I hear from female veterans is I couldn't talk to my family about my experience. I just gave them your book. Or thank you for what, you put in there about being a sexual assault survivor because it helped normalize it for me and I was blaming myself. And you know what I mean? So I think I hit on certain themes throughout the book because I thought they were important for us to talk about as a society. So after pilot training, I do 3 tours in Afghanistan. I was shot down, which is really, we can get into this later about the process of writing, but I wanted to write a book highlighting what rescue forces do in the Air Force and in Afghanistan in particular, because we always have a hard time getting funding every time our platform comes up for renewal or something like that. And so not a lot of people know the Air Force even has helicopters. Everyone always assumes I'm in the Army. So I was really trying to inform. And my agent was like, you're crazy. You got shot down. You fought to open jobs for women. You're sitting on this great story. You have to inform people about your thoughts on women in predominantly male career fields and rescue in Afghanistan through your story, which was daunting. And frankly, I was in the middle of the fight to open jobs for women in combat when I wrote the book, and I was telling other female veterans that they needed to tell their stories. We wouldn't stop getting nasty notes on our cars when we park at Home Depot in the combat veteran parking spot if we don't tell more of our stories. But it's daunting to tell your own story and put that out there. And when people tell me they've read the book, immediately they have me at a disadvantage. They know everything about me, just about all of my vulnerabilities and best and worst moments. And I know nothing about them usually. So it was difficult to write.
Wow. I definitely want to talk more about all of that. My goodness, you kind of hit so many themes
Yeah,
that
sorry.
I hear over and over again in these
Yeah.
conversations. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so are you going to give us a little reading, a little
Yeah,
taste of the
sure.
book?
Sure. I'll give you the prologue. It's my oldest son. I have a 7 and a 10-year-old, and I haven't let them read the book yet because there's a lot of F words. Not that they haven't heard that. And I don't, I'm not ready to explain to them what it means to be sexually assaulted and that kind of thing. Not quite
Of
yet. So
course.
they want to read the book. They haven't had a chance to, but I did read the prologue to them. So they loved it. So it's kind of got a place in my heart now. But okay, I glanced out the window at the dark shadows of sharks just under the surface of the sea. Shaking my head, I willed myself to focus on the task at hand as I continued running through the checklist, checking my equipment, reviewing where the emergency release was on the door, miming unbuckling the seat harness and unplugging my comm cord, checking to make sure the tiny oxygen bottle at my vest was charged and on. The bottle would provide about 30 seconds of air if we found ourselves plummeting to the bottom of the ocean. I was well aware of what to expect if we should have to ditch, as I had attended the thorough Dunker training in Alabama, where you were strapped into a mock helicopter, shaken, plummeted into a pool, and flipped upside down. But out here in the ocean, there were no instructors standing ready to save you if you went under. There were no sharks in dunker training either. My summer had been filled with exciting missions, putting out wildfires in California, marijuana eradication from vast national forests out west, and deploying to Texas for hurricane support. But my least favorite kind of mission would be the grand finale to that exhausting summer, a long-range overwater rescue mission. A fisherman on a freighter way out in the middle of the Pacific had been injured, so my crew and I had been dispatched to go pick him up and bring him to safety. Years earlier, during my first assignment in the Air Force, I remember clearly sitting in a movie theater watching The Perfect Storm when the film came out. I had cringed, barely able to watch, as the crew on the rescue helicopter realized they were unable to refuel off their airborne tanker to make it to dry land. When they ditched into the ocean, I thought to myself, whew, I really want to be a pilot, but I'll never put myself in that situation. You'd have to be crazy to fly a helicopter out into the middle of the ocean. Yet 8 years later, there I was, flying the exact same helicopter I had seen in the movie, out over open ocean, unable to refuel, and looking for a shark-free place to ditch. Just my luck.
Man, well, yeah.
My boys
I
were like,
read
oh
that.
my God, I'm so scared. And I'm like, yeah, but you know mommy's okay, right? Like,
Yeah,
spoiler
of course. You're here to tell it. Yeah, no, that's some great detail in that opening scene that really resonated with me as a former Coast Guard helicopter pilot. I just today posted an interview that I did with a couple of Apache helicopter pilots, women who, they had an overwater mission, and I talked about how I would chair fly that egress routine every time I got in the plane at night. And so I definitely was there with you on that journey. But I mean, the Coast Guard has many diverse missions, and you just, you talked about that summer, all of the diverse missions that you did. I'm so excited to talk about all of this. I just want to say first, though, that this book is ranks among my favorite memoirs that I've read so far. It's very tightly written, really well edited. You gave us as much information as we needed to really understand your character arc and your purpose in writing it. I'm going to, you kind of mentioned it before, and I'll ask you again, but it's pretty clear when you read the book why you gave us all of those examples because of the culmination and where that battle went later,
Mm-hmm.
and the street credibility that you had because of your experiences. So thank you so much for writing the book. I really, really enjoyed it. And like I said, this is a mentor text for anybody who is considering writing their own memoir, no matter what they're writing about. I just feel like it was really well crafted. So nicely done.
Thank you. That's incredible coming from you, especially. You have a lot of experience in this space, and I didn't know if I could write. Everybody I feel like has a book inside them that they want to get out, and maybe what stops a lot of people is that imposter syndrome or thinking they can't do it. And I'm glad I did it. So thanks for the great compliment.
Well, you mentioned earlier, you kind of gave us a hint about why you were doing this, but say a little more about why you wrote the book and what you hope it accomplishes.
Yeah, I felt like I often feel like when I find myself fighting an uphill battle, the first thing I like to do is make sure everybody has the same information I have. And if everyone has the same information and we still disagree, then it's a values issue. But I
Right.
felt like in fighting to open jobs for women in the Department of Defense, I'm kind of skipping ahead. So I guess, I took on the Department of Defense, but that sounds more conflict ridden than it actually was. The Secretary of Defense was looking for reasons to repeal the Ground Combat Exclusion Policy and, open all jobs to women for competition. They were facing some barriers. The Joint Chiefs unanimously supported us. But in the pushback that I was getting from various groups, I didn't feel like we all had the same information. Like they would say, we don't think women can do this. And I'm like, do you know women are doing this? And it was kind of that sort of back and forth. So really proliferating stories, getting more examples out there. There's incredible women who have been in combat, frankly, for thousands of years. It's not like, Americans tend to think that the history of the world is the last 200 years. I wanted to do a history of rescue in Afghanistan, maybe peppered in with a little bit of an agenda around the role of women, maybe even a little bit of a history lesson about Queen Boudica and, others. But I just felt like if while I was fighting the fight, realizing people didn't have access to the information or they were being fed misinformation, telling other veterans they needed to tell their story in order for us to move the ball. Yeah, I just felt like I had to tell this story. And I think the sexual assault's particularly important to
Yeah.
tell, because I had a female colleague reach out to me and say that before I wrote the book, that she was appointed to some commission to write a paper on military sexual assault, and that she just was having a really hard time because all the stories that she heard, she just knows that she would never find herself in that position.
Ha.
It was very victim blaming.
Wow.
And I happen
Wow.
to know this person, because we were very close. And this is not a judgment based on this action. So this is not me victim blaming, but I happen to know that there were times she went off in a, truck while we're deployed with a special forces guy or something like that. I mean, we're human, but she absolutely did put herself in those positions because
Yeah.
we live in those positions. You don't put
Yep.
yourself in the position to be assaulted. It's
Exactly.
not like that. You live your life. You can't live your life in a way that you say, hey, I'll never be alone with a, a member of the opposite sex. And that's not even to say, men tend to be, men are a much higher prevalence of military sexual assault survivors. We just don't talk about that as much. So it
Exactly.
was appalling to me to hear someone I respected talk about it in such a victim shaming way. And so I knew that when I wrote the book, I had to include that.
Well, thank you for doing that because I know that that's also very vulnerable for you. And I want to talk about that situation, and we'll give a trigger warning before we go into the details of that for anybody who needs that. But before that, and before we get into sort of some of the more interesting and there are also fun details in this book. Lots of you
But
obviously
no,
have agree. Yeah, it's not. No, it's a really great, inspiring story, and the things that you did, man, I was just like, wow, and I laughed for parts of it as well. So, it covers all the angles, but just for anyone who hasn't read the book and is curious about what a career like yours looks like, can you just walk us through that? Give us an overview.
sure.
What
So
brought you to the Air Force? Let's start with that.
yeah, I wanted to be Han Solo. And like I said, like being a combat pilot was the closest thing I could get to that, right? I knew
Yeah.
that a commercial pilot wasn't going to get me the kind of flying that I was looking for. And that was a great goal to have because it kept my nose clean, both with like authorities and getting in trouble and trying drugs. And like I was very boring in high school. And like, my friends would be doing stuff. I was on the soccer team, there was a lot of pot use, and I just wasn't doing any of it because I was OCD about checking the boxes I needed to check to become a pilot.
Yeah.
Went through ROTC, graduated, did not get a pilot slot. I hurt my knee in the middle of our categorization physical fitness test. I was the vice wing commander, I would like to think, and I had an okay GPA. It wasn't great. I think if my GPA had been higher or my physical fitness test had been better, then I would have gotten it. But because both of those things were, there, and there was a little bit of discrimination there because my cadre could have fought for me to be able to retake the PFT. They knew that I always had great PFT scores, but because I was in a relationship with another cadet who I ended up marrying, that they didn't approve of, and whatever else, like he got a pilot slot, they didn't stop him. So but that's, I try not to, I usually see discrimination as a last resort. You know what I mean? Like you can kind of
Yeah.
hear it in how I describe it. I'm like, well, I could have, I could have had a better GPA. I think that that's been an important part of my journey toward excellence, is that even if you are being discriminated against, if you rely on that and kind of give up, I mean, we can't do that. Like we have to be the cream of the crop to be successful in our situation as women, right? And
Mhm.
women of color even more so. And so every time I faced a challenge or a setback, I would turn inward and reflect and say, how can I make this harder for them to win? How can I be more competitive, right? So
Right.
I get a pilot slot, became an aircraft maintenance officer because I thought, learn about the systems, learn about the aircraft, it would make me a better pilot. Still with the idea of being a pilot. Was in aircraft maintenance for 5 years, and then finally got that pilot slot. Very excited. That systems knowledge came back later and saved my life. So I was very lucky that that was the path that I took. And then I flew for the Air National Guard for both the New York unit and the California unit, the 129th Rescue Squadron out in Moffett, which are an awesome group of people. And yeah, we had a lot of civil missions. In fact, my dream was always to be an A-10 pilot. And then I was offered an alternate slot with an A-10 unit, and I was offered a primary slot with a combat rescue unit for H-60s. And I was talking to who later became a mentor of mine, a lieutenant colonel, and I was explaining to him why I was going to go with the A-10 slot. I had to. It was the aircraft I always wanted to fly. And it was when he explained to me the civil mission and how the way he said it was like A-10 pilots train for conflict. You never want to be in a position where you're wishing for conflict, but everyone wants to use your skills. As an H-60 pilot, you'll be able to do civil search and rescue and wildfire suppression and marijuana eradication and all, plucking people off roofs during hurricanes and all sorts of fun stuff. And I was like, you know what, that's a good point. And I went that direction, and I'm really glad I did.
Yeah. And then spoiler alert. So if anybody prefers to see the story unfold on the page, go read the book before you continue. And then at some point you weren't going to be flying anymore.
Yeah. In the shoot down, my aircraft commander, George Dona, was an amazing aircraft commander and turned what should have been a crash into a semi-hard landing, like a soft crash, hard landing. And I hurt my back. And so, through a series of medical situations, was trying to figure out what else I was going to do in the military. Didn't want to go back to being a maintenance officer. And then I was like, there's this job called special tactics officer, which is perfect for me. Like, you have to have someone who understands 3D airspace, which is very difficult to teach someone if they haven't lived in it. You have to have someone who can speak pilot. Like, usually if you have a friendly fire incident, it can be, something that the special tactics officer maybe could have done, differently. Right. I definitely don't want to blame that career field, but I just mean, like, it would put me in a position to prevent friendly fire and to direct fire and support the ground troops.
It'd be a huge asset. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I couldn't apply for that job because you also have to maintain there's a lot of things that make you a successful special tactics officer. One of the things is maintaining a calm over the radio, because if you start to escalate your voice on the radio, then it tends to turn things badly. Be able to keep your head about you when the shit's kind of hitting the fan. I don't know, can I curse?
Of course, we're a bunch of pilots.
Okay,
yes.
Good. And so I really think I would have been perfect for that, but because I was a woman, I couldn't apply. Yeah. So. And to be frank, I didn't.
And you couldn't apply. Let's be specific about it. You couldn't apply for that because of the Ground Combat Exclusion Policy.
Right. So there used to be a combat exclusion policy that they turned into the Ground Combat Exclusion Policy to allow women to be combat pilots.
Right.
To allow us to serve our country. And then the Ground Combat Exclusion Policy was basically women couldn't apply for roles whose primary mission included ground combat.
Right.
That's why you find, women that are in combat as logisticians or, other roles, because the truth of the matter, and we can get into this more, but the truth of the debate around the Ground Combat Exclusion Policy, and I think what ultimately turned the tide, was pointing out that it wasn't, you have to kind of craft your message for your audience, so for progressives, we could talk about it's unconstitutional to bar someone from applying for a job based on their gender. But to conservative people, I had to show them that it was tying the hands of the commanders in the field, that commanders in the field were putting women into combat situations because they needed them. So, for example, you have a special forces Delta Force, team that needs to go and meet with a warlord and negotiate support and build relationships. But there are women there that need to be patted down for suicide vests. Well, they're not allowed to physically make contact with the women there. So they needed to send women with the Delta Force, and they would have to, get creative about their job titles and that type of thing. So they also were rotating women in and out. So a lot of times if you hear about, unit cohesion or morale issues, a lot of times it's because that's what will happen if you rotate men in and out too, because you have to, anyone who's been in combat knows you have to get to know each other and understand each other's strengths and weaknesses so that in a dynamic combat environment, you can support each other and cover each other's gaps and, understand how to, deploy the right resources at the right moment and give the right person tactical lead,
So, what you had this career and now you're trying to get a job where you can use your skills and still be an asset to the forces, and you're
Yeah.
denied that opportunity. And then you end up in this class action. Was it a class action lawsuit? Is that what we would
No,
refer to
there
it?
were four of us and an organization. So I don't think
Okay.
that's class action, but it was
Okay.
Hagar et al. V. Panetta, who Secretary Panetta at the time. It was the ACLU finding clients who were being impacted by the
Yeah.
policy. And, you know, the path I was about to go down earlier was when I found that I couldn't apply for that role, my first thought wasn't, oh, I'm being discriminated against. It wasn't about me. You know, I
Right.
was sad that I couldn't be a pilot anymore. It was my life's dream. But I was like, well, what's next? You know, and when I couldn't do that, I was like, oh, that sucks for them because I
Right.
would have been really good at that. And,
Exactly.
you know, I mean, I wanted to serve my country, but they won't let me give my highest tools and skills. So I'll have to go somewhere else,
Yeah.
you know? So for me, it was hurting an organization that I loved deeply.
Yeah.
And, you know, I remember after I got out, watching units that, you know, had people that I knew and loved and thought of as brothers and some sisters, very few women in that field, but there's a couple deploying and going and doing dangerous things, and I wasn't with them, and it killed me. It just tore
Of
me up in the
course.
head to watch
Yeah.
them. And, you know, I just feel like if we're in a situation where we are preventing the best people who can do the job from doing the job based on a demographic that we're making a generalization about, it just you know, doesn't make any sense to me.
I agree. Absolutely. So, backing things up to that early part of your career, you took a commission in the U.S. Air Force. You talked about how you didn't get picked for flight the first time, so you went and worked your ass off at one unit and got as smart as you could so you could get the recommendation of the commander, and on and on. And so, what derailed that?
I mean, so they only offer like 50 at the time. I don't know what the numbers are now. At the time, they only offered about 50 something slots to active duty members as a carrot, right?
Hmm.
Like, yeah, you can still be a pilot, but very few people each year are selected that way off of active duty because they've already got you. They've already got
Yeah.
you to sign, and they use those jobs to get people to sign, right?
Yeah.
But there were at the time something like 72 bases. What that means is the number one pick off each base is, you know, not guaranteed to get a slot, right? So if you were the number two pick, you definitely weren't going to get the slot. And there were a
Right.
couple times I think I was always the number one slot, except once when the commander decided to give it to someone else because she was older than me, and he
Hmm.
wanted to make sure she had a chance before she aged out, which I understand that, but it really pissed me off because I had a stronger package. I
Yeah.
had, you know, my private pilot's license and all these awards, and I knew how competitive it was, and I just felt like I was missing an opportunity. And so she got the number one slot, and she didn't get picked up. And
Sometimes I describe that as standing in line at the deli with your number
yeah,
because
yeah, and I
that's
was
not,
trying to do things the right way and
yeah.
trying to do them the way I was told and work my ass off. So then I changed bases, went to Whiteman Air Force Base, became the number one selectee there, got CGO of the year, you know, like all of that. But then I was getting my flight physical. And, you know, I mentioned how boring I was in high school and college. And, you know, part of that boring was I had only been intimate with one person, and that was my
Yeah.
husband, right?
And
Um,
here's our trigger warning for the next couple of minutes for
Yeah,
anybody.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And so because of that, I was very inexperienced sexually, very uncomfortable with my own body. And, you know, I think I lost my virginity when I was almost 22, which is older, you know, when you're in college and
Mhm.
everyone else is partying. And so every time I had a flight physical, I would go see a female gynecologist first and get my, you know, pap smear and gynecological exam out of the way first.
Which
Um,
for just for anybody listening and not familiar, that was pretty standard in my community as well. Like we didn't do that with the military doctors. We got permission to go off base, get our civilian gynecology exam, bring that back, and that
yeah,
got inserted into the package. So that from my perspective was pretty standard. Yeah.
standard, right? And
Yep.
I did it for 5 years, you know.
Mhm.
But you know, so I was at Whiteman dealing with this flight doc who reviewed all my records and did the flight exam, and then he said, "Okay, you know, it's time for your gynecological exam. You know, lay back and put your feet up. I don't have stirrups, but put your feet up on the table." And I was like, no, you should see in there. I just went like 2 weeks ago. have the results, yada, yada, yada. Right. Um, Basically we went back and forth, and then,
You're in a room. You're in the examining
yeah,
room.
yeah,
You're getting a flight physical. This is
yes.
this
Mhm.
and this flight physical is the thing that you need to have signed off in order to be able to continue applying for a flight
Right.
slot.
And for anyone who doesn't know, like,
Yeah,
it's a joke in our community that you can have like a hangnail, or you took
right.
NyQuil because you had a cough and you're disqualified. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like,
we're all
thing.
terrified of the flight dock. Like we
Yeah,
don't go to the flight dock. Yeah.
yeah. No, you're like, nothing hurts and everything's fine and I'm perfect,
Yeah,
because they'll
exactly.
sniff you for anything. Right.
Yeah.
So, and frankly, I was already uncomfortable because I thought that he had been a little gropey. Like, they also do like physical exams and they need to see your tattoos. And he did a breast exam that I didn't think was necessary. It was, we know as
Yeah.
women, right?
Yeah.
We know, right?
Yeah.
So he's presenting to me, as the conversation is escalating, he presents to me that he's going to fail me on my flying class 1 physical if I don't let him do the gynecological exam on psychological basis, because in his opinion it meant that if I became a prisoner of war, I would be more susceptible to rape and interrogation, and I wasn't psychologically strong enough to go into combat, which by the way is not what he's assessing for, to go into combat if I can't submit to a male exam. And it's not like I'd never seen a male doctor before, right? But at this point,
Right.
it was about the principle, right?
Yeah.
But he was holding my dream in front of me. And if I failed a flying class 1 and I was about to need an age waiver anyway, it was pretty much over for me. So I was in that
Yeah.
moment, I had to decide, am I ready for this to be over? So I said, okay, laid back, submitted. He literally popped a glove and said, you're not going to, I guess you're not going to enjoy this, which I thought was wildly inappropriate to say.
Oh, yeah.
Um, he proceeded to do a very rough gynecological exam, and I cried the whole time. Um, and I think what people don't understand about rape is you don't have to be physically restrained, and there doesn't have to be a sexual gratification on the perpetrator for it to be rape. And it took me
This
a while
was
to say the
this
word rape. I've been saying sexual assault, but I've been educated and informed that that minimizes what happened.
yeah.
Um, and I think, the power dynamic, that's what most often happens with rape. It's not about sexual gratification. It's about, I have power, you have none. I have a sense of entitlement over you and your body. I have been given this authority over you, and you will submit to me. And it's like a God complex.
Yeah.
So afterwards, I was in a state, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
I got dressed. I tried to leave, and an airman ran out and caught me on my way out to the parking lot and said, can you come back in? The med group commander wants to talk to you. That flight doc had gone to the med group commander and confessed what he did. And so the med group commander, I'm shaking and crying, and I come in and I sit down, and he's being so supportive and so, I'm so sorry about what you just went through, and oh my God, and we are going to punish him, and all of these things. And then at the end he said, oh, he called in my commander as well, by the way. It was humiliating. I wasn't ready to have this conversation in front of my commander. And so at the end it was, so we need to know if you're going to press charges.
So how did they find out about it?
He went and confessed immediately when I left.
So this was a thing that I was really like,
It
what the
wasn't even
hell?
like he told them what he did.
Why? What was behind that?
I
I
think he
wondered.
had to have thought that I was going to press charges.
So he was trying to cover his ass
I think so,
somehow.
and I think it was a kind of a, oh man, I really effed up. Are you guys going to cover me? Kind of thing.
Yeah, well,
Um,
that seems how it played out. Yeah.
I mean, I would have thought maybe it was a, hey, I just had to fail this person on a flying class 1 because she freaked out over a regular standard gynecological exam. It wasn't that, based on the response the med group commander gave me.
No, exactly.
He didn't say, hey, I wanted to talk to you because I just wanted you to know in person that you hooked your flying class 1, or you know what I mean? Like, they
Yeah.
passed me. They didn't put anything in my record about it. But it was his assurance that they were going to deal with it in-house. And he was like, you know, we need to know if you're going to proceed with charges, which in retrospect, super inappropriate for him to push me on and ask me about.
Absolutely.
And he said, you know, just know that if you do press charges, you're going to have to face him in court and relay in detail what just happened. And I'm still shaking and, you know,
Yeah, it's just happened. And
yeah,
you are the person, like everybody in the room has power over your career.
yep. But there was my
Everyone's
commander,
in a
there's
position
a
of
former
power.
colonel. I'm basically like holding my BDUs closed. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
it was an awful experience. Just, I felt like I got victimized again in that office.
absolutely.
But I said, no, if you are going to handle it and you're going to, you know, punish him and make sure he's never in a position to do this again, you give me that assurance, then no, I'm not going to press charges. And I very much obviously regret it now.
Yeah.
But in the moment, I just, he convinced me it would re-traumatize me. And, you know, I can give excuses all day, but I'm not going to like fall for blaming myself. I made a decision. You know what I mean?
Well, but you know what that looks like. We both know what that looks like. If you did press charges, you'd be reliving that over and over and over again, and you would
Not
have
able
been the
to.
one under the
Yeah.
spotlight.
Yeah.
Like,
I let myself believe what I kind of suspected was a lie, that they would hold him accountable.
yeah.
And then I was telling my commander months later that I wanted to leave, get out of the Air Force, didn't want to ever, I wanted to, I was like, you know, I might still consider serving my country. I'm going to start applying to the Air National Guard and the reserves, because in there you can choose your doctor. You don't have to submit to military doctors because, you know, when you're in the Guard and Reserve, a lot of times you're a
Exactly.
civilian, you know, most of the month, right?
Right.
You still have to submit to a flying class 1 exam, but still, I
Mhm.
just didn't like being told what doctors I had to accept, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, he knew that I was bouncing back and forth between like, I want to get out. He was trying to keep me in because I was a quality maintenance officer. And then, you know, I got awarded the operations group CGO of the year, and I was at the awards banquet, and they announced the 4 groups: med group, ops group, um, support group, logistics group. And he was the med group nominee for CGO of the year. And I mean, like the blood drained from my face, and I just turned and looked at my commander, and he was like, yep, I hear you. I got it. I'll support you processing the paperwork. Let's, you know, he totally understood that I was going to get out at that point. That's when I made the decision.
Yeah.
I felt very betrayed. Um, so
Betrayed by the organization, by the institution, you
yeah,
know? Yeah.
yeah. So I
Absolutely.
felt like it was important to tell, because on the one
Yes.
hand, we need to talk more about how people, not just women, get victimized in a power structure, an uneven power
Yep.
structure.
Yeah.
But we also need to talk about, you know, rape and sexual assault isn't always the Hollywood version of somebody trying to get sexual gratification and they have a knife to your throat. So to hear my female colleague act like, you know, I even told her my story after she came to me and said, you know, I just wouldn't find myself in that position. And I told her the story, and she was like, well, I wouldn't have submitted. And I was like,
Easy
really?
for you to say.
You really wouldn't have?
Yeah.
Like, you're a pilot. So you're telling me you would have given up your career. You would have faced
Yeah.
hooking your flying class 1 exam. And obviously, if I had known how that exam would have gone, I probably would have been like, all right, I'll do it, but not with you. Like, I'm
Yeah.
going to
Right.
reschedule this appointment, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely heinous abuse of power, heinous, disgusting abuse of power. And then the aftermath of that. Absolutely. I mean, how could you stay? So you
yeah.
joined the Guard, and I would love to talk about every page of this book with you because your story is so cool and so fascinating, but people are just going to have to go read it. So there are a couple of things I definitely want to hit while we're talking, and this was a really important part of it. So thank you for being so open about it. And just while we're on the subject, what advice do you have for any women who find themselves in any situation like this?
I would like to think things are a little better than they were when I was in. I've been doing some work, you know, that's part of why I thought it was important to fight to repeal the Ground Combat Exclusion Policy, because, you know, barring women from applying for the jobs that are central to our mission feeds the narrative that we are somehow MWR equipment. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
Oh yeah,
Um,
morale, welfare, and recreation equipment.
yeah,
Yep.
we're there for the morale and recreation of the
Hmm.
boys that are fighting our wars, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so relegating us to support roles only, and that is not a knock on people who are in those support roles, men and women. But it sends a message that women are not warfighters. They're not your equal. And so repealing the, policy was really important to start to change the culture. And I think we've done some other work to try to change the culture. But I think because of that, like, I don't want to sound like a hypocrite. I don't want to tell people to behave differently than I did, because then if you can't, you blame
Yeah.
yourself. So first off, if you find yourself victimized by discrimination, rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, wherever it is that you're being victimized, number one, always come back to rule number one, which is it is not your fault. I don't care what you were wearing. I don't care what decision you made. I don't care if you let something happen. I don't care if you didn't say no enough. I don't care. It's just not your fault. Right. So that's number one. But, number two, I think in this day and age, it's hard to rise to the level of command if you are not on board with the role of women in today's military and the awareness around things like mental health and sexual assault and all of the things that are, easier to talk about today than they were when this was happening to me. Oh my God, when was that? 20 years ago almost, you
Mm.
know? So don't take experiences like mine and think that we have to accept this type of treatment. You may not get support from your immediate commander. You might go find somebody you can trust, a peer, a first sergeant, just somebody that you can trust, and bring in the resources. And, you don't have to take on the fight for all of your colleagues and all the people who come after you. But if it helps you to stay the course, know that every time you stand up for yourself, there's a triangle cone of women, and not just women, but in this conversation behind you, who are going to come after you, who are going to benefit from the fight that you're fighting now.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I find, or at least that I think that I experienced, that I know I experienced, is that, because this was just a blatant and obvious offense, but the people who still are being successful in the organizations who came with whatever attitudes that they had and who choose to abuse their powers in whatever ways that they can get away with are much more crafty about it now, because the culture has evolved
Mm-hmm.
slightly, and therefore anyone who kind of tries to pull these antics does it in a much more insidious way these days. And
Yeah.
so it becomes even harder to know exactly what's going on. Now, I'm not just talking about like sexual assault or rape. Those things are very obvious, but, discrimination and those kinds of things have become, from my perspective, a little more insidious because of the cultural changes. And so hopefully we just continue to evolve.
Yeah, there's strength in numbers. That's why my
Yeah.
advice is like to find the people that you trust, because I do
Yeah.
think that there are advocates out there. I think bystanders do more damage sometimes than, well, maybe
Yeah.
not more than the perpetrator, but it's certainly up there.
Yeah.
I faced some things that happened with one of my units that I think it wasn't the comments of the person who was trying to get me in trouble. And, I'm talking about we don't have to go into the whole incident here. I know we don't have a ton of time left, but, somebody took a magazine out of my
Yeah.
locker and tried to get me in trouble for losing a magazine full of ammunition, and then
Yeah.
insinuated that I lost it out by the fence on my knees.
Right.
That person was uncomfortable with me in that role because he defined his masculinity by the fact that he could do that job. So if
Yep.
I could do that job, it took something away from his identity and as a tough guy, right? It's always the really insecure ones. It's never the guys who, know that they're badass, right? Like those
Right.
guys don't care. If you can do the job, then, step up.
Absolutely.
Um, but it wasn't that experience that was so painful. It was looking around and watching people I would have taken a bullet for avert their eyes and, get into a conversation with someone else because they didn't want to cause trouble. So,
The standard that you walk by is the standard that you accept.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, finding those allies and holding them accountable and saying, I saw you hear what was going on and you looked away.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and if you see that kind of thing, you have to be an ally for people and stand up and say something.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's all the great stories about you flying all of these incredible missions in the Guard, and I definitely want people to go read about those. I had a good laugh, especially with the marijuana eradication
Yeah, I was
stories.
hoping you would ask about that because, like, that story we just covered was an important part of the book, but it's a very small part of the book.
It
I
is. It
try
is.
to insert humor as much as I can throughout the book because I
Yeah.
know it's a heavy topic, you
Yeah.
know.
No. Yeah. That was a pivotal moment and an important moment for you, and important for people in the public to understand too. The kinds of things that we experience. But yes, the majority of the book is about lots of other things, and one of them is this marijuana eradication. Just talk a little bit about that
Yeah.
before we
So
move on.
the summer of 2008 was crazy hectic for us. We, I was full time Air National Guard, and so what our civilian full time, like non wartime peacetime mission was counter drug. Right, we were the counter drug task force. We were on the counter drug task force, and so we would go fly into areas of the national parks where they had marijuana fields, and we would pull out the marijuana, but we'd also have to pull out a bunch of trash and irrigation and just kind of like try to beautify the forest back, right? So we would work with the Department of Forestry. And in 2008, we were on a marijuana eradication mission, like forward deployed in Ukiah, I think it was, like the pot
Hmm.
capital of, and I used to joke with people that, like, I'm sorry, I'm the reason your pot is so expensive. And with the name of MJ, you can imagine like the jokes that we made. But we're in the middle of a marijuana eradication mission when the 2008 wildfires came through.
Hmm.
And so the forest we were operating in lit on fire. And all of a sudden, we got swapped to a wildfire suppression mission because we were right there. So what that looks like is you paint the helicopter with hot pink stripes so that you can increase your visibility in the smoke. You attach a cargo sling with a 200-gallon bucket on the bottom of your belly. You go and dip that bucket into people's water and then go dump it into, wherever the firefighters tell you. And it was an interesting mission. And on one day, we were flying like 12 hours. I mean, it was just insane. We were maxing out our crew rest, right? We were having to get like waivers for it, and we were fatigued and we were tired. And I was chalking up our behavior to that fatigue. But being a high reliability crew resource management aircraft safety, I was the safety officer. Like I'm the safety person, right? I was like trying to take in everything and be like, are we making bad decisions and getting pushed by the mission? Because you shouldn't make bad decisions because of the mission, right? Like,
Yep.
and I every step of the way I was like, no, we're okay. Like, let's keep going. And I mean, we came in and landed with like the fuel low lights on, which if you get anywhere near that, you get in so much trouble. You have to go talk to the squadron commander. Like,
Yep.
it's a big deal. But we went out on a pass and we were with an army helicopter and they had a better fuel burn rate because we were heavier and they weren't giving up. So we weren't going to we weren't going to be outdone by the army. Right. And
Yeah.
so we made the decision to go back, even though we were low on fuel, came back and landed on with low fuel lights, got out of the aircraft after a long 13-hour day or whatever, and, debriefed the mission. And we were having a kind of a good time and we were all clearly exhausted, piled into the back of a truck, drove to the local diner, sat in the diner and walked in and everyone was like, ooh, the glass case had like all these pies and stuff like that. And we just sat there and ate for like an hour and a half and we ate like all the pies and we were texting the squadron commander, who in the Guard, it's a little bit like less, I don't know, chain of commandy. Like in the
Yeah.
Guard, you don't PCS out. So you're more of like a family. But we were giving him shit about something and he group texted all of us and said, I think you guys need to get piss tested when you get home. And we all got the text at the same time and we looked at it and we looked up at each other and then just like laughed, realizing, oh my God, we've been flying in the smoke of the same pot fields that we were pulling pot out of. We were very clearly all extremely high, but none of us would have recognized the symptoms of being high because we had never tried it before, because you get tested all the time. And if you pop positive, that's the end of your career.
Yep.
So, I think to those who know the symptoms, when you read through the details of the story, like I'm trying to give you a quick recap, you
Yeah.
can pick up that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a good time.
That was a great story. The other great story that we're not going to have time to chat about because I want to definitely want to hit a couple of other things though, and that this is the book is worth reading just for this is that a story of how you went your aircraft went down in Afghanistan and how you got out of there. And that honestly, like I know that's a very traumatic experience for you, um and I'm sure you had to deal with it, emotionally or whatever, but that was some Hollywood shit. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, that
Yeah.
was some Hollywood shit right there,
That's why I wrote the
like,
book, because that's what my agent said too. She's like, this is some Hollywood shit. Like, you have to
yeah,
use this dramatic,
it's
Schwarzenegger scene to get the book in people's hands to deliver the message you want to deliver, you
it's
know?
insane. Everybody go read the book for that alone. It is, I was just, my mouth was on the floor. I was just like, what?
Yeah,
That
it
is
was, I say
insane.
Schwarzenegger uh, as a slip because like at the time in the California Air National Guard, he was the governor at the time. And so he
Uh-huh.
was technically our commander in chief. And
Yep.
then, we get shot down. It's a very dramatic story. We get surrounded by 150 enemy fighters. We're holding our perimeter, firing back. Our cover ships go bingo fuel and ammo. And before they leave, they decide to land next to us. And if we can hold on to the outside of the Kiowas, then they'll pull us out that way. And so my crew and I got exfiltrated out, standing on the skids, holding onto the rocket pods of the tiny Kiowas. And there were just a ton of, get to the chopper kind of jokes and, um, to try to cut the tension. But we felt very much like we were making Arnold proud.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so thank you for everything that you did for the country. You aspired after all this. Well, first of all, like you really did make yourself vulnerable, fighting the fight to allow women to into ground combat. But then you decided to take it one step further and run for office.
I've taken
Oh
it a
my
few steps further,
word,
I
woman.
feel like. Yeah, running for office is not what I thought it would be. Let me just
Oh,
put
well,
it that
say
way.
more. Well, tell me why. Tell me what you mean by that.
So I think, I was about to say there's two types of people. That I hate it when people say that. There's many different types of people, but in politics, there's like people who run because they want the job. They want the power. They are ambitious. They've wanted to be a senator or president or whatever since they were little. And then there's people who kind of don't want the job and are a little pissed that they have to do the job because the people doing the job are screwing it up so badly. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how I was. I fell into that latter bucket of like, I got to quit my job. I got two kids and a mortgage. I don't want to quit my job, but you guys are screwing this up
Yeah.
and I got to do something about it. Right. I felt like, I had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I don't think people really know what that domestic threat to the Constitution looks like,
Yeah.
but I felt it. And so I ran for office. And long story short, there were things about me and my character that made it easier for me and harder for me. And I
Mm.
think the thing that made it easier was I came off as very authentic because I was brutally honest and
Mhm.
could talk easily about my flaws, and I wouldn't use car salesmen, not to knock, that's, people who sell cars. But like I wasn't a greasy snake oil salesman like a lot of politicians are. People would ask me questions that get direct answers that maybe they didn't always agree with, but they didn't feel like they were being talked around, you
Right.
know? So that authenticity led to a lot of success in there. But at the same time, there are times when you have to compromise your character and your principles. Um, and in defense of people, there are some really good people in office right now. I can count on one hand the number of people that I interacted with, and I interacted with most of them, who were genuine servant leaders who really took the time to sit and mentor me, or, because they thought me fighting this fight would help the larger group attain what they wanted to attain. So for example, I ran for office against someone who had won his last race by 30 points. So when that congressman would fundraise, he could go and give all that money to other candidates. But when he did beat me, but he only beat me by 2 points. And so 2.9, so almost 3 points. So I had, he had to focus on me. It helped the group, right?
Yeah, right.
But most people in that space are really out for themselves and out for power and will do whatever it takes to keep themselves in power and are thinking about that next level of power. And that was really heartbreaking for me to see, because I felt like I took a bullet for this country, for our voting process, for our democracy. And I felt strongly like they were disrespecting my sacrifice by not serving their constituents and serving themselves. So at one point, one of my staff members said, because I wouldn't do something they wanted me to do that I thought was a compromise of my ethics and my principles. And they said, gotta say, your character and your principles have really become a liability on this campaign.
Ooh.
And I was like, okay, I'm out. Like, this is not the, industry for me. So I still stay involved. I think local politics is really important. I think the lower on the ballot the race, the more impact it has on your life. I think people get very upset about the top of the ballot or very excited about the top of the ballot, but it's those down ballot races you really have to pay attention to and get educated on and get involved in and volunteer for and, just take part in our democracy.
MJ, I so wish I could have all day with you. This book, though, everybody go read this book. You can learn so much more about MJ and her story through it. It's wonderful. I have all the respect in the world for you. Thank you for everything that you have done, for having the courage to put yourself out there in ways that a lot of people aren't comfortable doing. To further the causes that you cared about and that affect the people who come behind us. So thank you so much for everything that you did.
Well, thank you, Liz, for that. It was my honor and started off as a very selfish endeavor to just be Han Solo and grew into something bigger. But thank you for what you're doing, because I think, the people you're interviewing and the attention you're giving to these stories is really what we need in this country. And to proliferate those stories, like I said earlier, is really important. So thank you for what you do.
It's my honor and my pleasure.
I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say